Today we talk about one of the most talked about developments in the tech world, DeepSeek. This Chinese AI startup has shaken up global markets, challenged US tech giants, and sparked political debates worldwide. Welcome to Riks Europe, Jonathan Gibson, AI researcher and political commentator.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's great to be here.
So could you explain why DeepSeek has become so controversial, and also what is the main purpose of DeepSeek?
Yeah, absolutely. So DeepSeek broadly is, as we all know, like the Chinese AI startup firm. It's based in Guangzhou, and last month it released these huge two models, the DeepSeek R1 model and the DeepSeek V3 model, which, as we saw, wiped billions of dollars off the market value of chip giants like NVIDIA, which stock priced plunged 17%, and the Nasdaq fell more than 3%. So it was really, really significant, and investors started really panicking. And this is because for a couple reasons, but the main thing is that much like ChatGPT, which many of us have access to and kind of use and see, it has a similar level of performance, yet for significantly lower compute costs. And the fact that it was able to do this when generally a lot of people thought that it was all about compute and pumping huge amounts of money and resources into this was quite remarkable. So just to develop a little bit of that further, in terms of the costs, one of the big numbers that was banded around was 5.6 million. So this was the training cost that for a single training run that DeepSeek claimed to hold, in comparison to GPT, which costed near 100 million, and the inference cost as well for DeepSeek was far lower. So this is kind of the computational cost to achieve an output. When you put in a prompt and get a result, that has a certain cost, and for DeepSeek it was far lower. What was also remarkable is that it was an open weight model. So that essentially means that the weights of the model are available online. It uses an MIT license, which is very, very open, very free. There's very limited downstream restrictions on how you can use this commercially. And so people who are pro open source technology, so sort of downloading and sharing all the model weights and information about this, were very supportive of this, but obviously it's quite contentious in the field. And the final things are probably around the Chinese context. So obviously we saw some of the discussion around censorship being embedded, and it's raised lots of questions around whether these sorts of chatbots should have certain things which are banned or not banned, what sort of context, how should the state relate to this? There are also concerns regarding data privacy and security. And people aren't necessarily so understanding of this, that it's not DeepSeek itself that holds the data, but it will be the platform that so it'll be China, for example, you're trusting with your data on this, or it'll be Perplexity if you're using the online version. So it's sort of the website host, which is essentially gaining access to your data. And the final thing is, because it's not a for-profit model, it doesn't make money off of that. In fact, it's loss-making in a similar way to OpenAI was at the start. They were able to release their product at a far lower and far more competitive price than OpenAI, which obviously you have to pay a certain amount to achieve the higher range models. So that was also very significant, and one of the big reasons why lots of people downloaded it and started using this model.
And you mentioned costs there a little bit. The DeepSeek R1 model is known for being very cheap to run, but some people doubt these claims. How has DeepSeek responded to these doubts?
Yeah, so the first thing to note is this number of 6 million banded around. It doesn't actually account for a lot of the other costs. So it doesn't account for the fixed costs, the expenditure on building, and developing the centers, the talent, the compute. So there's a lot of things that are not accounted for in this number, and it's certainly not the total development expenditure. It's also not necessarily so surprising to people who are closely following the field. Efficiency has massively increased over time, and you can look at sort of scaling laws and other scenarios in which there have been these massive reductions in costs, and it kind of somewhat follows these sorts of models. But actually, you can look at how it's responded is by showing in the papers that it's produced the algorithmic efficiency and the greater, more efficient architecture. So there's been some quite significant innovations in making the model more efficient and essentially shifting out the cost curve. So there was quite a lot of experimentation. They used quite a lot of young, new talent that basically didn't have to unlearn some of the things that we previously maybe thought. And this is really interesting in the Chinese context because it's not coming from one of the big tech giants. in China who previously have to sort of recruit people who have had 10 years of machine learning experience at Google or whatever, and everybody wants them. Rather, it's people who thought maybe slightly left brain, slightly differently, and use things like reinforcement learning rather than fine tuning. Basically, ways, and once you've done the initial training run, making it so that you have this really efficient model. And people really like the fact that it shows its kind of chain of thought reasoning. So the fact that it wasn't for profit, it was kind of quite smaller, more nimble, funded by a quant firm, which was really interested in developments rather than kind of profit, allowed it to actually break through some of these hurdles and really innovate in a way that was quite significant. There is lots that we don't know. So we, for example, don't know how the training data was acquired. People think it was sort of diffused from the ChatGPT o1 model, where essentially you run the ChatGPT model like very, very fast, lots of times, and you extract lots of the data that's produced from that. And also, obviously, it doesn't account for the cost of the chips, which are very expensive and would have significantly marked up the price. But people are talking about Jevons paradox, where essentially you see efficiency gains through innovation, which means there's greater demand. So there's more widespread adoption and greater diffusion as a result, which might actually offset the efficiency gains. So it's really, really interesting to look at how they were able to make these changes. And because it's open source, this will be being adopted by lots of other companies. So I'm sure we'll learn a lot from this.
And Donald Trump, he called DeepSeek a wake-up call for the US tech industry. What did he mean by that, and how could it affect the US tech and global competition?
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of hyperbole around DeepSeek, and who was it? There was Mark Andreessen, I think it was, who referred to it as the Sputnik moment. So essentially, I think this is because it was a shock for a lot of companies. People didn't really see it coming. It was quite small and suddenly broke through onto the stage. I know the Anthropic CEO talked in a podcast like China Talk, where he said that he'd been keeping an eye on them for a year. But I think to a lot of people in the field, maybe it was slightly surprising. And also, you just seen at the same week lots of investment in things like Stargate, hundreds of millions into these data centers, which we think, and to be honest, I still continue to think are really, really important. But it raised concerns that maybe we don't need all this compute. Maybe it's not that important, and rather other things are more significant. And also, we'd always thought there was quite a significant gap. Most experts thought about 2 years between Chinese tech firms and US tech firms. And so the fact they were able to produce this sort of frontier technology, which really was competing, in some cases outcompeting US firms, was really significant. And I think what Donald Trump, how I interpret the wake-up call for the US tech industry, is it's kind of a reframing of some of this into a more direct and more outward call for race competition between sort of these countries. So previously there was a lot of thought looking at this on a more corporate level. But you've got a lot of people surrounding Trump currently in the field, people like Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, Elon Musk, who have been kind of pushing a lot of the narrative around China and the US sort of race dynamics. And so there's been growing support for administration for sort of killing regulatory or safety efforts, and greater accelerationism, greater investment by the government into these resources. So I think there's a couple of ways in which you can interpret that. But I think also the timing of this release was really important. It was released in the week of the inauguration, which is a pretty pivotal moment in US policy. And maybe part of that was to rattle the confidence in the US. It sort of mirrors the Huawei product launch during the former Secretary Raimonden's China visit. So there's quite a lot of different moving parts here, and how Donald Trump will approach the tech industry is a really, really interesting topic to unpack. And there's actually quite significant differences within his administration, within people in his party, and within his voter base around how they view the US's strategy towards AI. So it's something that's really important to consider.
And you did mention AI chips previously. Trump's team is said to be thinking about stricter rules on selling AI chips to China. How could this impact the US-China relations?
Absolutely. So that's a really, really good question, because chips are so important in US-China relations around AI. They really are the key bottleneck for China in terms of AI development. The CEO of DeepSeek went out on Twitter, I think, and said this, and this has been pretty well known and documented for a long time. I think one very important US official also went on, I think it was Hard Talk or something like that, and talked about how there were significant gaps in chip production. And that's because essentially the US has a key advantage over the supply chain for advanced semiconductors. It's really dominated by the US and its allies. So currently there's only one manufacturer, which is in Taiwan, called TSMC, and they're able to build the most advanced semiconductors, relying on the Dutch company SML to build them. So there's very like one company essentially able to do this, and there's a really tightly controlled supply chain. So the US has obviously sought to leverage this. So in 2022, Biden introduced export controls, which prevented or tried to prevent Chinese access to cutting edge chips. And these efforts were largely continued during Trump's first administration. So this whole DeepSeek thing, just tying back to kind of the main focus of this podcast, has led to some, in my opinion, quite bad takes regarding export controls. People suggesting that they haven't been working, or they're still there's no point in them, and you need to focus on other things. But it's important to note that export controls, and these export controls that have been developed under both administrations, have a time lag, and China actually stockpiled chips prior to the export control ban. So DeepSeek had assembled a cluster of, I think it was 10,000 A100 GPUs a year before the export controls were released. And we've still seen kind of evidence that smuggling remains a problem. And, access to powerful chips currently and will continue to play a really important role. So if DeepSeek, for example, was trained with the B200 chips, which are NVIDIA's latest generation of chips, they would be much more powerful. So it really kind of impacts the whole ecosystem of large-scale AI deployment and capability advancement. So in terms of Trump specifically in chips, he's threatened to use tariffs, which he's clearly a big fan of, on foreign production of computer chips and semiconductors. So he's kind of trying to threaten them to return manufacturing to the US. But at the same time, what's kind of quite interesting and possibly difficult to understand is he's also threatened to end the Chips and the Science Act, which Biden introduced, which sought to boost domestic production. So there are concerns amongst economists and sort of political economists around this dual-pronged approach, which could potentially slow or harm the goals. And we never really know what he's going to do. I'd be somewhat surprised if he overturned the CHIPS Act, but you don't really know. And obviously, there's been massive rhetoric around avoiding overregulation. So, JD Vance, before the AI summit in Paris, was talking about his concerns over Europe and regulation, and kind of they've put significant pressure on Europe on the EU AI Act to get rid of the limited liability clause. So there's a lot of discussion around avoiding strong regulations of these companies because of these kind of innovation dynamics and concerns around competition with China. It's also very interesting to look at the Chinese regulatory landscape, and be more than happy to talk that, but I guess that's slightly outside the scope of the question. And then you asked as well, was it about the Chinese response or global response, was it?
Yeah, there is obviously this DeepSeek has caused a political global tension, especially between the US and China. How do you see this developing?
Yeah, so I mean, we've already seen significant responses from China. So China's banned shipments of several minerals used in semiconductor manufacturing and military applications in response to these export restrictions. So these include dual-use items, so minerals that China has significant access to, like gallium, germanium, antimony, and also super hard minerals. They're talking about graphite as well. And trade associations in China, of which there's, I think, 4, have told members to reduce purchases of US chips, which they don't see as safe or reliable anymore. And this has led in the US to a twofold increase in mineral prices around germanium and gallium, because China produces 98% of the world's gallium and 60% of germanium. This is really, really significant, and these are really vital resources used in semiconductors and all sorts of very important applications. So they are willing to target Western economic interest in their sort of efforts to hit back. They want to impose and push some sort of costs. So we're kind of seeing this broader diversification maybe on both ends, where initially China maybe had been a little bit more reluctant to do this. Now it's actually ramping up this sort of movement towards these sorts of policies. And they also threatened to restrict exports of critical minerals to Japan, for example, if they signed up to US export controls, which they were thinking about. But it's not necessarily, and this is important to consider in China, it's kind of a fragmented authoritarian structure. So there's lots of different interests and lots of different competing interests. So, for example, it's a balancing act between Beijing's interests and not appearing weak in response to this and trying to use some leverage on the US. But also, you've got international businesses who really are being affected by this. So, for example, the stock market in Shenzhen slid 10%, I think it was, over 2 days after the announcement of the US blacklisting. So, there is some concern around if we go over the top on this, it might massively hamper business, which could be bad for the economy and have some quite deep rooted impacts. And just looking at this like a bit more broadly, right? You've got a period of time at which there's great power transformation potentially happening, and there's China's on the rise, and people are thinking maybe the US is declining in power, maybe it's retreating from international institutions, becoming more isolationist. Trump is maybe possibly an effort to reinvigorate the US's power and restate it, and is a very precarious time, particularly when we see great power transformations. They're often very dangerous, and often they have feature wall. And technology and great power technology, AI technology, is something that we don't really know. Nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen with it. It's really difficult to tell. Maybe it's like the 90s with the internet, and nobody really foresaw exactly what the ramifications will be. What we do kind of know is that it feels very important, and it could potentially change a lot of dimensions of the way we live, and it could potentially change comparative advantages in power. If you were to integrate it, things like cyber warfare, things like autonomous weapon systems might play a really important role, things like surveillance. So there's lots of ways in which it could potentially radically alter balances of power between countries. And the US is actually determined not to get behind on this. If China carry on producing, carrying on innovating, and they've got their own incentives in this, that you need to ensure, party security and party structures, they're playing also a balancing game. The US want to maintain a comparative advantage and focus on their national security. But then there's also complicated by areas of international security. And the fact that we don't know what these things could do, there could be really significant risks we're not sure about. So it's a landscape that's moving so fast, and it's so important. And it'll be really, really interesting to see what the developments are. 2025 promises to be a really big year in the field. And so I think it's a really important space to keep an eye on, particularly in the context of US-China relations.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Gibson, AI researcher and political commentator, for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.